I'm kind of the facilitator of this Teaching with Legal Collections session. We have four presentations with five presenters today. All of us are dealing with kind of US legal materials, and we're basically going to present in chronological order of these collections at our repositories. So Sarah, Julie, and Sarah will be presenting mostly on, I think, colonial US records at their institutions, and then Amanda and myself will be dealing with kind of somewhat more recent materials. Before we kind of get into all of those all of our presentations, I wanted to start with a bit of table setting. I think in prepping for this session, I thought it might be useful to kind of like define some terms, define the term legal records. I was unable to like find one definition of this term, but I found a couple that I thought would be kind of useful to kind of get us started in this conversation. So the first one on my slide here is from the archival field, and the definition is that legal records are records that were created by or involved in litigation of any kind. And then the other definition we have is from the legal profession, which is legal records are documents produced by lawyers, judges, and other legal scholars in the day-to-day course of their work, which I'm also kind of loving this definition, the second definition, because that day-to-day, in the day-to-day course of their work is very, I feel like, reminiscent of how we define archives in our field, kind of in general. So I was also in thinking about this session, kind of thinking about are interested in kind of categorizing and differentiating between different types of legal records. And again, I kind of struggle to find like one single explanation or kind of model. But in looking kind of across different sources, I was able to piece together like a very broad framework for these materials. So kind of in very broad strokes, legal records can be divided between private records and public records, with the private records being kind of the papers and files of lawyers and judges, and then the public records primarily being court records, but also some kind of court adjacent records from a more religious kind of angle. And so when we set up this session a few months ago, we titled it using teaching with legal collections. As it's turned out, we're actually, I think all of us really focusing on those public records, primarily the court records, and a little bit of the court adjacent ones as well. So the court records include materials from state and federal court systems. They also include materials from criminal and civil jurisdictions. And they also include typically, I think, case files, plus these like bound volumes of like minutes and journals and dockets and things, with the case file containing kind of all of the instruments or documentation pertaining to the case. So again, this is kind of where we're focusing our presentations today. So, so I think without even me having the slide here, I think we could all pretty easily just kind of brainstorm and kind of like talk off the cuff about what the challenges of using court records are. I think we either are familiar with them ourselves, or we could just kind of imagine what they would be. And we actually kind of did a little bit of that in just, the five of us planning this session. But in doing a bit of research for this kind of table setting moment of the session, I had a bit of an aha moment when I encountered this definition in the middle by Canadian archivist Catherine Shepherd, which is the idea that unlike private legal records, court records are created to suit the official requirements of the judicial system, and this determines their language, form, and organization. So the kind of challenges that we are kind of maybe familiar with are kind of like outgrowths of this kind of central characteristic of these court records. So the large physical volume is daunting. That's one thing I'm going to kind of focus on in my presentation, but it's also, not unique, I think, to court records. We're familiar with those in other contexts. But I think kind of to summarize all of these, or most of these challenges that I'm showing here, is that they arise from the fact that these court records were created by legal professionals for themselves and for other legal professionals using legal vocabulary that Shepard describes as, quote, investing the records with that mystique of the law that legal language generally tends to produce in the minds of laymen, which I thought was kind of fun. And these documents are also created within the constraints of kind of legal procedure. And then by contrast, as archivists and librarians and information professionals were trying to come in kind of secondarily without possibly that legal background and trying to navigate these records secondarily. So I will say that it was really interesting just in prepping for this session and talking to my co-presenters. It does seem, and I think this might be a thing that comes up throughout the presentations, that not all court records are kind of equally complex. And it sounds like some records are actually maybe not all that complex, but and we kind of hypothesized, that the complexity of the records and the kind of maybe has increased over time, kind of in relation to the professionalization of the legal profession and the modernization of the court system. But it does seem like even if the actual complexity is a little bit more, not quite as robust, that there's like an intimidation factor that goes with these records that kind of adds to the actual complexity of them. So the other challenge that we're going to, I think, talk about in our sessions are, or at least some of them are, handwritten documents, which I don't have on this slide. And again, not unique to legal court records, but that is another challenge of some of these materials as well. So despite all of these challenges, of which there are several and many, our kind of argument or our thesis for this session, and the reason we all wanted to do it, is that we think that legal collections and court records, court adjacent records specifically, are really valuable in the classroom because they can contain compelling stories that might not otherwise be told. They recover the voices of individuals who are often omitted from other historical records, and they can engage students in broader conversations about laws and legal history, but also topics such as race and servitude, gender, sexuality, and public health. So I think our hope for, or one of our hopes for our presentations, not just to kind of share what we've been doing, but also to help our colleagues kind of maybe utilize some of these legal records if you haven't done that before, maybe kind of dip your toe in and maybe feel more comfortable doing that with your own collections. Before I turn it over to Sarah and Julie, I just wanted to end with a couple of kind of final thoughts. These are some quotations that I found in the course of my research and prep, and I don't know, maybe I just can't resist myself to include them in the slides. But the first quotation is from, I believe she's a historian, Alicia Simmons. When we open a criminal file, what we often find is a record of a vulnerable person captured mid-fall within the sticky webs of state power, who offers a fragmentary, mediated account of an extraordinary episode in their life, which now comes to us through the vocabulary of elites. And then the scholar Arlette Farge also described that there's not, or kind of commented that there's nothing like the judicial archives, which are the rough traces of lives that never asked to be told in the way they were, but were one day obligated to do so when confronted with the harsh reality of the police and repression. So both of these scholars are specifically talking about kind of criminal cases and criminal case files, but I really think, and my co-presenters, I believe, agree that their points are kind of broadly applicable in thinking about court records and historical court records, kind of reminding us about the people who are at the center of these records. That includes the attorneys, the judge, the other officers of the court, but also this kind of wide cast of people who are the victims, the accusers, the suspects, witnesses, jurors, all these kind of people who are kind of in this story, and that's kind of what we're thinking about. So that is what I had as far as my little table setting, and so I think I'm going to turn it over now to Sarah and Julie.
Share my slide.
And Sarah, before you get started, I forgot to mention at the top that we have allotted we're hoping about 15 minutes at the end for questions, like a question and answer and a discussion, and for people to share their own experiences. So you all can drop comments in the chat in the meantime while you're thinking of questions, or raise your hand at the time. But we are allowing for that at the end of the session. So with that, Sarah, go for it, not go away. Sorry.
Thank you. You're fine. I can do either. All right. We can see slides. Yes. Okay. Great. So my name is Sarah Moazeni. I am a research and instruction librarian at Wellesley College, which is an historically women's college. I think I might be alone in this group that my institution doesn't retain any court records itself. I used to work at an archives, but now I work in the classroom solely, teaching, doing traditional research and instruction work. But I want to talk to you today a bit about using court records and trying to pull back a little and think about how we can use court records despite their elite origins and perhaps because of them. And then I've got two examples from classes that I teach or go into, and I can show you different ways in which I use court records. So, as my title alludes to, I want to share with you all a quotation from Audre Lorde: "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." There is nothing like a master's tool like the law, and like legal records and court records. So I love to think with students about, what sources are available to us when we're studying, especially the early modern period, the colonial period in what is now the United States and what would become Canada and Mexico as well. Uh, Largely, what's available to us tends to be these elite records, whether they're court records, church records, these shouty archives from the elite. Those are what built and supported and what now comprise the master's house. So, how do we use these dominant records to teach the history of anyone but the elites? I argue that we can, and I think it's really effective in the classroom. So these legal records are the instrument through which communities, colonial powers, and churches and others defined and reinscribed norms. In American colonial history alone, they preserve records of same-sex sex, of intersex people defining who they were. Of self-fashioning of gender, of suits of freedom from slavery, declarations of intent to marry across race, things you might not expect to see in them, and things that you won't necessarily hear about in other types of records from this place and time. I've got some quotations here from a wonderful historian named Emily Owens. She wrote a book a few years ago called Consent in the Presence of Force. And so these quotations are from her introduction to the book. She works heavily with legal records in Louisiana and mostly New Orleans, but not exclusively. And she's looking at slave and free status as well as sexual assaults with respect to women. So I'm just going to read part of the final quote. It says, "People tend only to come to court when something in actual life is out of step with the law. I find court records really helpful to understand what is actually going on the ground versus what was intended to go on. What did the elite government or church want to go on, and what was actually happening?" Um, and so, I don't know that we're dismantling the master's house per se, but maybe we're understanding it better, and able to read against that grain by using these records. Court records, as we know, are also ubiquitous. They tend to cross social classes, sex, race, sexuality. They're fairly easy to access. They tend to be heavily digitized, and they are often even potentially transcribed depending on the place and time we're talking about. So they're very accessible for undergraduate students who I'm working with. Um, so they're a useful way to study these people who may not have written. Their records that they did write may not have survived, or they may not be available to us. So now I want to look at two examples of how I use court records in teaching. So the first example is a course I taught this past spring called Bodies in the Archives. It was situated within the Women and Gender Studies department, and it was basically archival theory. I called it a secret methods class when the students had already signed up. And what we were doing is we were looking at somatic experience at bodies themselves in different contexts with respect to race, sexuality, sex, lots and lots of medical records. So here you see some sample topics for the sorts of things that my students were interested in. It was an upper level undergraduate class. It was a research seminar, so they were all going to be performing their own research by the end of the semester. I think the court records are fantastic practice for these students to become immersed in the time and place that they're learning about. In this class, they they always had readings for each week that contextualized the records. Sometimes the records we looked at were lifted from the readings themselves. But so they always had additional information. Occasionally, when I go in for a one shot, I'm able to assign readings, but it doesn't always happen. So I was really lucky to get to assign all readings for my own class. We talked about how court records are not in any way neutral. We talked about how they're produced, who produces them, who transcribes them, who is on juries, who becomes a judge in the colonial period in particular, so that they could start to think as they read through them about what was happening beyond just the words on the page. Court records do a really good job of teaching the limits of archives too. So we would find records of people who were indicted but not named, people who it seemed were involved but were never questioned, depositions that had disappeared. So figuring out who was in the voices of the archive is really helpful for students who are new to history or students who have some experience. So I'm going to show you what we would do in a typical class. So in a typical class, we had 2.5 hours, so we would spend time discussing the readings, certainly, but we would spend half of each class either in our archives on campus, in special collections, in our museum, or looking at reproduced archival collections that I would print really big and in color and pass around on the table. So this was one example. I think it was probably the week on sex and sexuality. We looked at some records that had been reproduced in a physical volume that was in our library stacks. So these were bastardy examinations in what is now England, what's now the UK rather. And you see, I tried to reproduce 4 pages of this because you see they each is about the same size. Each record has very similar language. And the student said, wow, these are repetitive. And I said, yes. So that tells us what is normal, what is asked, what isn't asked. And the deeper they got into these records, they could see who was having sex with whom, or who was saying they were having sex with whom, where these people who were sort of the middling sort, they were almost all working class, where they were able to have sex was usually where they worked. It gave them a better understanding of what happened when you had sex outside of marriage. And it was really eye-opening for them to understand what was going on with these people who might not otherwise pop up in the records, besides in baptismal, birth, death, christening, those types of records. Another class that I want to talk with you all about is one that I've done one shots for, which is itself about the law. The first class is about sex and sexuality and race and these types of things, and I inserted the law into it. And this class is about crime and punishment in early America. So I wanted to complicate the records a little bit for these students because my role was to come in and explain how they search for records and how they might start to interpret them. So I have some sample topics up here again. It was all focused on early America, especially the Eastern Seaboard, as many things are, especially New England, because we are a New England institution. So it's also an upper level research seminar, so they were going to be doing their own work. So we really wanted to think through some close reading with the students. So I brought curated resources like you see here to ask the students a narrow set of questions to get their minds in the zone of interpreting and thinking laterally, where else can I go to continue to chase down this topic or these ideas? This is one of my favorite records to use in classes where I'm trying to spark interest in primary sources and in legal records. This is not a traditional legal record, it is a church record, but it's from these like punitive moments in early New England ecclesiastic history. So this is from a church in Barnstable, Massachusetts. The widow, her name was Thankful Bacon, which is a fantastic name. The widow Thankful Bacon was a widow for longer than 9 months, but she turned up pregnant anyway. So the church wanted her to formally apologize, to be readmitted into their fellowship. So this record describes what her crime was, and it describes what she said to be readmitted, and then the vote to readmit her into the weekly, more than weekly fellowship of the church. So I did transcribe it for them because because I'm kind and I was only spending one day with them. But you can see here, this is just a screenshot from the space that I gave them. They annotated the different materials on there. They put their key terms that they wanted to use. See key terms over here on the right side that they wanted to use to search for additional materials. And they really brainstormed and got into just this one page of one putative record. And this set them down the path of thinking about their own interests and finding their own materials. So they were able to see, they were able to think more when we discussed out loud, well, what would happen if this person was enslaved? What would happen if this person had been married, but the father wasn't their partner? So it really spun them off in different directions, and just a small example of close reading was able to get them thinking about many different things that would inspire future work. So, in short, I think early modern court cases, like Caitlin gestured at earlier, there are some of the shorter records. They're pretty straightforward or easy to understand as so far as you can understand the handwriting. And they can be really great entry points for students to start to explore the world, like the early modern social, legal, sexual, medical world that is so fascinating. So thank you. And if you'd like to talk further, my email is on the screen.
Awesome, Sarah. Thanks. All right, now I think I'm going to share my screen. I can't see anybody, but can someone say something if they can't hear me or see my screen? Because I should try that. Oh, okay. Okay, so again, my name is Caitlin Klepper. I am the public engagement librarian at sorry, no, I'm okay. I'm the public engagement librarian at the Spencer Research Library at the University of Kansas. I've been in this role since January, and my kind of focus in my new role is on K-12 and community engagement. But I've been at Spencer since late 2012 as the head of public services. And so in that role, I work with a lot of classes and primarily KU classes. So I'm going to be talking about some of the strategies I've used with our district court records with students. And I felt like this, I'm a big Fleetwood Mac fan, so I thought this quote was kind of appropriate for working with these materials in my experience. Um, So just before getting into the records themselves, I did want to just give a little bit of background on the library. So we are located are on KU's main campus in Lawrence, which is in Douglas County, Kansas. We're in kind of far eastern Kansas. Um, and we're, the Rare Books, Archives, and Special Collections branch within the KU library system. I've listed our four main collecting areas on the slide, but for today's purposes, I'm going to be focusing on our regional history Kansas collection because the Kansas collection is the repository for Douglas County records. This is a huge collection. It includes approximately 1,260 linear feet of boxes, volumes, and oversized items. And it basically covers the entire history of Lawrence and Douglas County about 1855 to 2000. The Douglas County records overall are divided into 17 series, and there are actually a couple of those series that either contain or are entirely court records like municipal court or probate court. But I'm going to be focusing today on one series, which is just the district court records. So again, just even the district court records are a really daunting subset of the Douglas County records. I've listed the cubic foot boxes there, the extent there. One of the tricky things about these records is they're not searchable, they have not been indexed, they're not digitized, they're not transcribed. They're just kind of like a sea of these cases. Basically for reference queries, if someone is looking for a specific case, for their involving their ancestor or a particular person, you have to get the dockets, which is even now I'm always a little bit not sure which one to grab, but you have to pull one of the dockets or some of the dockets to get the case number and able to, so you can pull the case file, and that's where kind of all the good stuff is. Um, and luckily in instruction, we kind of bypass all of that, the dockets and the journals and things and focus really on those case files. So that, we're not navigating that process. Um, our finding aid for this collection notes that case files may include some or all of the types of records listed there on the chart. In my experience, most of the case files are actually relatively small, and they tend to focus on kind of documenting the legal process or the history of the case. By themselves, they provide some juicy details, but kind of leave a lot of questions unanswered about kind of who these folks are, especially the parties to the case, and kind of like what happened after the case and that kind of thing. But there's kind of enough there that it's really pretty interesting. I will say that the criminal case files are kind of the more exciting of the two, sets between criminal and civil, probably not surprising. A lot of our civil case files involve a lot of like money, debt, money collection, land issues, that kind of thing. But there are, not to, I don't know, make light of people's misfortune, but yeah, our life situation. But there are also divorce cases in some of our civil case files, which can be really interesting, especially before no fault divorce, can provide some really interesting insight about how people were like, advocating for, their divorce in court. Um, did want to share just a couple of pictures of what some of these materials look like at our repository. So this is a mixture of some of our criminal and civil case files. As you can see, they're stored in various types of archival and non-archival boxes. Some of the handles are, as you can see, have been, are no longer functional, which is always fun. Um, I have also definitely pulled boxes. You can kind of see in that picture in the upper right. I've definitely pulled boxes that are still taped shut from when those boxes were, I assume, transported from the county over to the library. You will see some flags in there periodically of like missing files or missing documents or missing paperwork. That's from the county, not from us. So there are times when you go to pull the case file and it's one of the ones that's missing. So that's always unfortunate. I will say, kind of on a positive note, that all of the files have been removed from their various trifold folders. The folders are included in the file usually, but they've been removed from the folders, unfolded, and flattened. So they are, relatively easy to use in that way. They're not all kind of folded up together. So kind of the the good thing one of the things that I like about court records is I do think that they, and the case files in particular, I do think that they tap into students' kind of interest in, drama and mystery and true crime, obviously in a respectful way since we're talking about real people who lived in the past. But the conundrum is, how do we locate these kind of cases that are these stories that are noteworthy, thought-provoking, engaging, meaningful, within a sea of case files that, quite frankly, are maybe not terribly interesting to, you know, K-12 students or college students. They're maybe interesting to like a business historian or, different groups of researchers, but perhaps not this particular audience when we're, teaching. So I do think, kind of like Sarah was talking about, I do think there's, obviously value in having like a highly curated selection of documents in a very structured activity. I actually do have an example from my own work involving other local court records at Spencer that I could talk about in the Q&A if that would be helpful. But for purposes of my presentation, oh, I didn't actually move my slide. I'm going to actually advocate that I think one good strategy to think about is to think about using boxes and not just individual files or documents. I think, in short, kind of thinking about using the volume of the records to our advantage and not trying to fight against it. So in this case, what I have done is I'll have students work in small groups, maybe you know, five, 3 to 5. And then instead of giving each group an item or a file, they would have an entire archivable box, and kind of turn them loose, obviously with very clear care and handling guidelines to kind of turn them loose into the box. Students can pair up and look at files together. They can all pull different things if they want. Um, but I've used this strategy elsewhere too. I think this is a good strategy for other types of collections where it's just like a lot of material. So like the chancellor's office records at our institution. So I do think that this experience or this strategy, students do seem kind of more engaged with the materials and each other, and because they have some freedom to focus on what excites them and what interests them. I do think this strategy lends itself to maybe having students do some kind of rough data collection as they go. What are people being charged with? How frequently are certain things being charged? Can students tell from the case files who's being charged in terms of gender, race, income level? Are any KU students involved in these cases? So one drawback is that students may spend less time with like an individual file and doing that kind of in-depth analysis that I think we like to do a lot. But I think there's also a way to incorporate that into this process as well. So I do want to kind of end with kind of three specific kind of entry points that I've tried with this. One is just to like choose the first box of what we have. I think I think people are interested in like what's the first case, the first box, the first thing. Um, uh, Admittedly, our first box of civil case files is not that interesting. It's a lot of promissory notes. But our criminal case files is kind of a better option for us. One of our previous student assistants was a law student, and so she actually had the idea to just pull the first criminal case and see what it was. So this is what the grand jury indictment is there on the screen, and basically this David Logan was indicted for the theft of quote 1 mare of a bay color, which I really enjoy. And so our student went and dug around more in newspapers.com and actually discovered that the Mr. Logan was actually a person of color, which complicates the story more. And she found additional information about the case and kind of how it appears to have played out. I will say, just in me kind of going back and going through the box, you do find some, not just this individual story of Mr. Logan and other individual stories, but it was interesting to go through and just look at what types of things people are charged with beyond the things you might expect, like assault and murder, but a lot of, selling liquor problems. I enjoyed open and notorious adultery, which apparently is still a criminal charge in Kansas, although not prosecuted. So just kind of going, again, looking at the aggregate, kind of what are these different charges people are being charged with. Another strategy I've used is to just choose a time period. Usually one connected to some kind of major local event or national event. What in the box, what in the case files reflects that moment directly? What are some other indirect things that are communicated about that time period? I kind of stumbled into this approach. I had to pull some materials for a historical methods class. And they were focusing on the 1920s, and most of our manuscript collections they're not arranged chronologically, so it was hard to find boxes that had enough, 1920s material in the box for the students. And so because the court case files are arranged chronologically, it actually worked out quite perfectly. So this is again two criminal cases from the files that we found. But on the left, we see, and there are a lot of these in the 1920s in our criminal case files, people being charged with possession of, I think it says intoxicating liquor, and then also transporting intoxicating liquor, usually describing, and I enjoy on this one how it says it was being transported by a Ford coupe. So some good details in there. One thing we discovered that was unexpected, which is the document on the right, is that apparently cigarettes were illegal in Kansas for some period of time in the early 20th century. And the students stumbled upon this and asked me about it, and we were like, that can't be right. And we had to look it up on the fly and confirm that in fact it was having cigarettes or distributing them was a criminal offense in Kansas. And I think in this document it's a city ordinance, but it was also, I think, illegal statewide. So some kind of fun stuff there. And then, so these two examples are kind of one-shot examples that I've done. But I think there's also an extended version. I think these court records lend themselves to kind of more extended interactions, to do more research. The case files are really valuable, but they're incomplete. So for our records, at the very least, I think students really benefit from at least being able to access like the federal census and newspapers and city directories and maybe even ancestry, and try to look up at least some of these folks, maybe look up statutes, that kind of thing. So one of the history professors that I work with has a historical, like a research internship course. And because I had talked to him all these years about these court records, and actually the previous example from the 1920s is the same instructor, he used our Douglas County court case records or court case files as like the body of materials for his students to engage with. So he has done this history 493 course 3 times, and kind of turned the students loose into the collections to kind of look at whatever, whatever interests them. I think many of them have, it's a pretty small group each time. It's like, 2 to maybe 5 students. I think all of them will like try the civil court case files and then maybe not find them to be the most interesting. And I think they end up kind of gravitating toward the criminal case files. Some of them have also wandered into the coroner's files, which are kind of adjacent, not quite the case files, but still in the kind of judicial system as well, and have found some really great information. I think they've had a positive kind of research experience, and we've gained some information. I do think I'd like to, I keep thinking as this professor does this, that I'd like to maybe encourage this process going forward for the students to be a bit more structured in time and place, and maybe have like a research question, maybe some more specific or systematic data collection. So, but again, I guess my take home or my final thought here is that I think or at least our court records at Spencer really lend themselves to both kind of one-shot instruction, but also some kind of deeper dives across longer periods that can involve, pairing these records with other materials and doing deeper research into the people involved and the context and that kind of thing. So again, my contact information is there. So I welcome further discussion and anyone to reach out to me if you have any questions, even after the session. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Amanda.
Okay. Let me check this. And so, hi. I am going in, I'll see my slides quickly. Okay, so I'm Amanda Norman. I'm here on behalf of the Opioid Industry Documents Archive, or OIDA. I'm bringing us all the way into the contemporary records here. We are a groundbreaking digital archive of documents arising from the opioid industry, working to advance understanding of the root causes of the opioid epidemic and help address corporate behavior that is harmful to public health. We want to serve as a living repository of information that can be used to learn from the opioid epidemic, so we can improve and safeguard public policy and public health, and to try to work towards not seeing or ensure that opioid-related harms that have taken place don't occur again. Our project is different in many ways from typical collections, but I'd say the archive is mostly the product of document productions from litigation. We work with attorney general offices, support legal reference. We have Bates numbers as an important metadata field, and a lot of other legal connections. Our document types from these productions that didn't become legal collections are emails, memos, presentations, sales reports, budgets, Drug Enforcement Administration briefings, meeting agendas and minutes, expert witness reports, and depositions of company executives. Uh, our team has created a number of resources to help with further exploration, teaching, and mining the archive. For example, we have been making use of our UCSF and Johns Hopkins faculty relationships that have been built into the archive structure and developed this open access curriculum that's grounded in the cultural determinants of health framework that are corporate practices that shape health outcomes. The OIDA curriculum combines historical analysis, archival document interpretation, and structured discussion within an interdisciplinary framework, and you can access it well in that URL there. Our materials were piloted in multiple educational settings, including undergraduate public health courses, graduate public health programs, nursing, doctoral programs, and medical schools. UCSF first-year medical students participated in a small group workshop integrating a brief lecture with guided analysis of internal opioid industry documents. Credit here goes to Cecilia Tamori, Dan Cabela, Kelly Knight, and others at Hopkins and UCSF for leading these efforts. I haven't been the one in the health science classrooms. We have so those people listed, I just listed there, nursing, medical faculty who have done that, but we've also adapted the curriculum and used documents in journalism and health writing and rhetoric classes, and we're working to connect the curriculum to a variety of teaching faculty. Some of our benefits of using legal documents: most of our documents came to us via legal processes as documents collected in production for litigation. As such, our documents usually have Bates numbers, which is how courts keep track of documents in a production, and that provides us with a unique form of metadata that lends a legal form of original order and makes it easier to find attachments to emails and thread emails, an email chain, and things like that. Using legal documents like depositions and exhibits also helps us and our users and in the classroom identify important themes and hot docs, as the lawyers have called it to us, as spotlighted by attorneys. This has allowed to help us to make some unique guides like this marked up judge's decision, where we've added hyperlinks to documents that we have in the archive that are referenced in this judge's decision. Some of our challenges: we are working with an emotionally charged subject, since many people have experience with opioids and or know someone who has experienced substance use disorder. Our lessons begin with content warnings and acknowledge the uneven harms of drug policy across populations. It can be jarring to see how casually people talk about drugs and the archive, and part of the discussion often touches on how we see these corporate conversations distance themselves from the opioid crisis. More specifically to legal collections, we have to do some leveling for ourselves and others, since we're not lawyers or legal experts in the archive and we don't know all the jargon. We do work with AGs who worked on these cases to help us better understand them in the court processes. They've helped point us to some great resources within the archive, like this document that includes the search terms that were used to create the productions for a couple of our collections. So again, kind of giving us the provenance of how all these documents came together in that particular collection. We also have to do a substantial amount of redaction work, since these records often include personal identifying information. For most of our collections, companies redact before documents come to us. We then do QC, quality control, and we often find overlooked private and health information. We do have a robust takedown policy if something private were to make its way online. Feedback from students and professors: they've highlighted strong engagement with archival materials and increased awareness of corporate strategies shaping clinical practice as they look at these emails and PowerPoints and things like that. Facilitators, ourselves and professors, other professors who have used the curriculum have reported high levels of participation and discussion in the small group sessions. And so here's all the information about how to get to us and to subscribe to our email. I will also be talking more about this, specifically with teaching in the health sciences in that session later today. And now that we've heard from the whole panel, I think we have maybe a few minutes for questions if anyone has anything.